Hey guys, it's Mr. Thibodeau. So let's talk about your history stuff, okay? So starting off, slavery. Yeah, we're going right into it. Slavery sucks. Um, I think the big thing to know here, and they do a decent job of this. Folks will always try and make the best of a bad situation. They're always going to try to, find ways to make life worth living. That does not mean they're happy, right? Um, the fact that there were rebellions, the fact that white folks were constantly scared of black folks rebelling, shows you they didn't want to be there. You don't rise up in armed conflict because you're happy, okay? Um, there's a big push to try to paint a bunch of folks as happy slaves, and it's not true. No, people are people. Nobody wants to be a slave. Okay. I think it is important to note that there were many skilled workers and artisans who were slaves, which is also true in the old Roman Empire as well. You don't just need builders or you don't just need builders can be skilled. You don't just need manual laborers. You also need skilled people. And so, if you can enslave them too, sure, why not? Um, I The other thing I want to talk about real briefly is that slavery was profitable. Slavery was very profitable, and it was not gonna go away. I talked a little bit about how before the rise of cotton gin, there was talk about it going away, like that it was possible. It was still valuable. They were still making money, because whenever you enslave somebody, you're giving them literally the least you could pay them, and so they're still making money before the cotton gin with slavery, but it wasn't growing to the same extent. And so people who, didn't like slavery, which a lot of folks didn't feel comfortable with it, they were starting to think, well, maybe we should just get rid of the slaves. It's not worth the moral headache. But then with the cotton gin, suddenly it's like, oh, I can get really rich. Well, never mind. I can deal with a little moral headache. I do want to say, Enslaved Hill did everything they could to try to cope with their situation. This is where the idea of black people are lazy comes from. If you are a slave, you have zero incentive to work as hard as you can. So why work as hard as you can? Of course they're going to work as little as possible because they don't care if some white guy gets rich. That's not important to them. The other thing is when they actually do have a rebellion, there's not, unfortunately, a lot of rebellions. White folks worked really, really hard to prevent these rebellions. And part of what they did is they put a lot of different African folks together who spoke different languages, right? Africa's huge. It's like putting a French guy and a German guy and a English woman and Spanish, all together. They're not going to be able to talk to each other. So you had this. They worked really hard to make sure they could not talk to each other, though black folks found a way, as anyone would. And things keep starting to get real bad. I will say, 1740. Okay, we're starting to see things get even worse. This is where we're starting to see the laws where if you have a child, they are now also a slave. Your children born into slavery are going to continue to be slaves. This is a big deal. This is it means you're a slave from the moment you're born. It also means that if you are a slave, you have every incentive to get out. You can't lie to yourself and suddenly say, "Oh, hey, like at least my kids will be free." That's not a thing anymore, okay? Here's some really important documents from the time. I think that's important to point out. And we have life of various folks, because even though they weren't supposed to be able to read and write, black folks are smart as you or I. There's no intelligence differences between different skin colors. I mean, you might think there's an intelligence difference because some folks have had more schooling than others, right? If you've had a black person who's, been a slave their whole life and has had no education, and you're a white guy from a rich family who owns slaves and you've had private tutors, of course you're going to think you're smarter than the other guy, right? Because you haven't taught the guy anything. But actual intelligence, the ability to problem solve and to learn and grow, there's no difference between those, okay? And so black folks would teach themselves how to read and write. Anyway, this is all important stuff. Gristmill, okay, we see a little bit about how some of the agricultural stuff is going on at the time. We're seeing the various commodities that the society is making. Let's see, I just want to make sure you only need 149. Okay. The types of immigrants, right? Black folks aren't the only ones coming to these new shores. Every single time an immigrant has come to America, people have been upset about it. Native Americans were pretty upset the white folks showed up. English folks were upset the French folks showed up. They were upset with the Germans actually were, and the Dutch who owned New York were upset that the English showed up. The English were then upset that more Germans showed up. Everyone was upset that the Irish showed up, upset that the Italians showed up. They're Catholics, and people at that time didn't really care for them. So constantly immigrants are, every single time they show up, people are like, oh no, they're changing everything. It hasn't. Not really. We'll get to aside from colonization of white folks taking over America, we'll get to the one situation, the one time where letting immigrants come in and welcoming immigrants has backfired, and those immigrants have then taken over the country. I'll talk about that later on. But for the most part, it's never a thing. They usually get here and are part of the group. Religious tolerance, conformity. Okay. We're saying kind of this is all pretty important stuff. Let's see. Colonial men and women. All this is relatively clear. Midwives at this time were performing abortions. I don't know if that is interesting to you. It's not going to be until the early 1900s that male doctors are going to try to claim that these midwives are inexperienced and incapable and shouldn't be allowed near pregnant women. And they really slander the midwife profession. Midwives actually had better success with a lot of pregnancies than doctors did, because the early doctors didn't understand hygiene very well, and so they'd bring in all these fancy tools, but the fancy tools would be dirty as heck. And so many women actually died because of doctors as opposed to midwives. Midwives used kind of practices that they had determined from a long time, and so were generally pretty successful. There's definitely things they could not do that doctors were better at, so it depends on which kind of issue you were having in pregnancy. So there's a little bit of crapshoot which one was better. Midwives ultimately get villainized by doctors in America, and that's also about the time that America starts to be against abortion. Part of that also comes into the effect of the first anti-abortion stuff in America was because they were worried that white women were getting abortions and people of color were not getting abortions, so they were really worried that white folks would no longer be the majority, and so they wanted to do anti-abortion stuff to prevent white women from stopping their kids. And then they forced sterilized people of color so that they could never get pregnant. It was a whole thing in the early days. Anyway, just a little history thing on that, just because midwives were really tied up in that. Great Awakening, Enlightenment. Okay, we're starting to see a religious revival again. These religious revivals are pretty interesting because they're very different than the religions they're really different than Catholicism. Okay, they're really moving away from the idea of, and then the reason I say that is because the early Protestant or Church of England, was very close to Catholicism. It was basically Catholicism adjacent. Because while they had some new ideas, the only way they knew how to have religious services was through Catholicism. So things were very similar for a long time. Now we're really seeing people really rethink how to be Christians and to really change how to love and worship God or whatnot. So this is a big change, big divergence. Okay, we're getting a lot of people who are very just charismatic and loud and closer to what we think of now for some of the Southern Baptist sort of religions. Still pretty different, but pretty interesting. That's all I got for you guys. It's mostly pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of big stuff here. I mean, there is, but the book does fine on it. All right, guys. Have a good one.